I've probably told this story a million times before, but there was a point in my time here on YouTube when you could describe me as a little black-pilled on survival horror. Not in the sense that I didn't like the genre, obviously, but to me it was essentially a long-dead art form. Something to look back on and reminisce over because there was certainly no way we'd ever see games like that again. It was an opinion that worked its way into tons of my old videos and something you could find in countless responses to commenters. But after years of taking first place in the world's biggest Negative Nancy competition, an unassuming little title came around and knocked me right out of that mindset. 2021's Tormented Souls may be far from the first volley in what is now a modern survival horror renaissance, but to me, it's the most important. It was my first run-in with the new genre revival and showed me that developers had what it took to make the kinds of games that I loved again. So now, with the release of its long-awaited sequel, we've run into a bit of a complicating issue. Because not only does Tormented Souls need to provide a robust enough experience to stand on its own, but the legs holding that experience up need to be strong enough for the added weight of fan expectation. Me expectation. I'm the fan in this scenario. So today we're launching headfirst into a game that I absolutely fell head over heels for. Looking to see if it not only keeps the fires of classic survival horror gameplay burning hot, but if it's good enough to surpass its well-loved predecessor. What's up, guys? I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews. Because it's been about 4 years since the release of the first Tormented Souls, my original idea was to spend these early moments of the video reintroducing everyone to its specific gameplay style. But as I played more and more of Part 2, I came to see it as a nearly one-to-one recreation of all the same mechanics and systems. So instead of starting out with what would prove to be a redundant recap, let's just dive into this thing, and if any context is needed, we'll address it as we go. Tormented Souls 2, just like its predecessor, is a classic survival horror game in every meaning of the term. It aims at the sort of gameplay foundation you would commonly find in mid to late 90s entries in the genre, and unlike a lot of its modern-day indie peers, it's more interested in meticulous reproduction as opposed to evolution. And what I mean to say with all of this is that if you've just found yourself finishing up a playthrough of, say, Resident Evil 2, you'd be able to jump into this game with such a smooth transition you might not even be aware you ever turned off your PS1. Now, for a lot of you watching, that's likely going to be all the information you'll need, but in the spirit of completion, I'm compelled to be at least a little more specific. So let's break things down into their base elements and see how each one performs both individually and by comparison to the first game. Starting off with exploration, I think is the right move here because not only is it what you'll be doing for most of this game, but it's also one of the most important factors to nail down in this genre. And I'd like to say that fans of the first game's pitch-perfect understanding of survival horror progression are going to be happy to know that absolutely nothing has changed in that department. Tormented Souls 2 absolutely thrives when it comes to putting you in a complex environment and letting you slowly unlock all of its nooks and crannies via backtracking, item collection, and puzzle solving. And for anyone who doesn't have a lot of experience with this kind of game, that can be one of the more difficult aspects of survival horror to parse, because normally the word backtracking is used more as a critique than it is praise. But I think you'll find that when a game is designed from the ground up to both facilitate and optimize for including backtracking, it's a very different story. Kind of like the way Metroidvanias work, Tormented Souls 2 will start you off in an explorable area that represents a very small portion of what's actually available to you. And as you crisscross the parts of the map you do have access to, you start incrementally unlocking more and more of it. Each time this happens, your scope of how large the world map is increases, and this is beneficial in a few different ways. On one end, your constant trips back and forth will instill a sense of familiarity with the location. So when it comes time to use that handsaw you just put together, you'll probably remember, oh hey, isn't there a frozen nun holding on to something I need in the kitchen? So as you continue to explore this place, you'll start getting more efficient at navigating it, which, no joke, is just as satisfying as getting more proficient with the character in a fighting game or learning the best route in speedrunning. It's a muscle that gets stronger with repeated use, and it feels great being able to flex it. Running perpendicular to that is the near constant dopamine hit of uncovering a new portion of the map. Because not only do you now have a brand spanking new couple of rooms to run around in, but you also know that this will further enable you to make more progress, as each one of those rooms or hallways could contain any number of key items or puzzles. It's a nearly self-sustaining system that, in the right hands, can make for some of the most rewarding exploration you're likely to find in any type of video game. And in order for us to really get into how well Tormented Souls 2 handles this specific pillar of survival horror gameplay, we're going to have to look back on how Part 1 did it. In that initial entry in the series, you could find a king's feast of cool locations to slowly snake your way through, but one aspect that stood out to me in particular was how good it was at bending back in on itself. Meaning, as you moved further and further into the Wild Burger Hospital, later sections would have some kind of a shortcut that could be unlocked, leading you back into some central hub area. So as you uncovered more and more of the map, you were also making subsequent trips back through already tread ground a little shorter and more convenient for yourself. And I don't really need to go on some long-winded explanation of how well that same system works here in the sequel, because it shines just as bright. Almost every single area you find yourself treading through is going to include some kind of little side route or shortcut that'll connect you to whatever part of the map you may want to end up in. Of course, it is important to at least mention that TS wasn't the first one to figure this little trick out. I mean, you could find the same thing happening right from the start of the genre in the first few Resident Evil games. But that being said, I think this series may make better use of it than really any other survival horror game I've ever played. And it does feel pretty nice knowing that the people cooking up your exploration also have some degree of respect for your time. And you know, for the moment, I think that's the perfect concept to end on, because I'd really like to touch on something pretty amazing that happened to me during this playthrough. For those of you who never played it, Tormented Souls Part 1 had this amazingly creepy setting. It was called the Wild Burger Hospital, and most of the game took place in it, although you did spend some time in the sewers, a mausoleum, and an old bunker as well. If I had to compare it to one of its contemporaries, I'd say it felt a lot like the first Resident Evil, with most of the effort going into that initial location, but ending on a few smaller areas meant to shake things up a bit in terms of the style of your surroundings. And as I played Tormented Souls 2, I was getting the same feeling. The Chilean convent that Caroline found herself in was every bit as fun to explore as its predecessor's main locale, if not maybe a little more so. But then, at about the 3.5 hour mark, something very cool happened. What I thought was a relatively self-contained environment suddenly opened up into this comparably huge village center that connected me to several more survival horror playgrounds to get lost in. Now, as someone just watching this video, without having gone through the experience yourself, it might be a little hard to see why this had such a big effect on me, so I'll try to explain. See, in the first game, the route to the end was relatively linear to a degree. After finishing with the hospital, you climb down to the basement. From there, you'd proceed through the mausoleum, then into the sewers, which led into the bunker. But here in Part 2, just as I had polished off the convent, when I had expected to continue on to something at least visually similar to the religious-themed, old-timey, Mostly wooden adorned environments I had spent all my time in up to that point. There I was, staring down the business end of a zombie apocalypse-esque sort of contemporary street scene. At this point, I was entering levels of excitement that flat out transcended quantification. I mean, truly, I had zero issues with the whole desecrated place of worship thing, but this brand new area with its vastly different look and feel gave me just the right kind of reset that I didn't even know I needed. And beyond the mere change in scenery, this ended up being a bit of a hub area, so I could count on even more moments like this in the future. Speaking of the future, or more specifically time in general, now's probably a good opportunity to mention Tormented Souls 2 is one hell of a long survival horror game. According to the internet, it's got an average of about 12 hours to beat, but I ended up finishing it in just a little over 15, making it, I think, the longest game in the genre I've ever completed here on the channel. And if you compare the maps for both the first and second games, you can see where all those extra hours came from. By the way, I have to credit what you're looking at right now to the YouTuber Demogen. This guy puts together these amazing walkthrough style complete maps for Metroidvania and survival horror games. Like, he makes these things himself, completely from scratch, which I would imagine requires an insane amount of effort, so head over to his channel and give him a sub if you're into that kind of stuff. Back to business though. To put things lightly, in terms of content, Tormented Souls 2 is twice the game as its predecessor. Truly, without exaggeration, you could easily fit several classic survival horror games into every 2 or so of the maps here. And while I had zero issues with Tormented Souls 1 spending so much time split between so few locations, I gotta say Part 2 really did the runtime a solid by giving me so many different types of environment to explore. Okay, so this might seem a little off topic, but recently my wife decided she wanted to finally beat the first Silent Hill game for herself. So every few nights when she has time, we sit down and work our way through a bit of it. And I bring this up because the introduction of this hub area gives progression in TS2 an almost Silent Hill type of feeling, where you have these interior survival horror romps that eventually dump you back out to a town that connects you to the next location on the list. I'm not sure if it's just me, but there's something about that formula that really keeps me engaged in making progress. I think just knowing that it won't be too long until I get to see some new type of place really does a lot to motivate me in the moments when I might otherwise feel a little fatigued. Continuing with the SH similarities, Tormented Souls 1 and 2 both contain an otherworld type of place that the player can transition into, and I'm gonna be honest, I'm sort of split down the middle on this whole deal. Back when I played Part 1, I felt like this mechanic was a little out of place. Kind of like it was just thrown in without regard for how it would fit in with the style and feeling that the game had already cultivated. And I think maybe that opinion has shifted a bit. I assume it's because this other side mechanic has already been set up in that initial title, but I'm at the point now where it's just kind of what I expected from the sequel. That being said, while they don't stand out so much to me anymore, I also don't think these sections are done quite as well as Silent Hill's Otherworld. In those games, you would shift into this twisted version of your environment after exploring most of its original orientation, which means 2 things. 1, the player gets a refresh if they were beginning to get a little tired of the scenery, and 2, the developers could squeeze almost twice the playtime out of what is mostly the same environment. And I would say that's a win-win. Here in Tormented Souls 2 though, outside of maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, these areas only allow for very limited exploration. In some cases, only a single screen or 2, so it sort of feels like this mechanic isn't really being taken advantage of very well. Instead of being able to run around the entire building, you just spent an hour memorizing, getting used to a twisted mutation of its previous layout. You might get a few rooms worth of that effect. I mean, listen, it's not exactly a negative or anything, but given the lack of depth with the other side, I kind of feel like it's the least fleshed out feature the game has to offer. More than anything, you could probably call it a missed opportunity. On the plus side though, it is at least tonally consistent with its predecessor, which is, that's something. Regardless of the at best underutilized and at worst redundant other side though, The point here is that Tormented Souls 2 absolutely nails the type of exploration and progression you would expect from a game wearing the label of survival horror. However, exploration wouldn't really mean too much in a title like this unless there was something working against it. Something keeping you from just moving through the game world unimpeded. And to be sure, this genre is very well known for coming up with two powerful responses to that issue: puzzles and combat. So how about we shift gears and head into the latter part of that dichotomy? Before we do though, I want you to take a look at something, just real quick. What's on screen right now are the analytics for some of my most popular videos. Videos that have performed reliably well for years on end. And as you might have noticed, they have something in common. Each one broke its long-running trend of solid performance around November of 2024 and essentially died in terms of views. Now I'm showing you this because I think it paints a much better picture of what's been happening to my channel than just showing you how poorly my recent videos have been performing lately. Because in a situation like this, it's easy to just assume maybe something has negatively changed with the way I make videos, or maybe people are no longer interested in my kind of content. Believe me, these are all things that have crossed my mind as well. But I think the fact that viewership and by extension revenue for some of my most well-liked videos across the board took a nosedive in the same exact month, it might show that something else is going on here. And with YouTube keeping its inner workings so close to the vest, I'm not even going to pretend to know what that might be. Does it have something to do with them pushing out an update to the way short-form content views are counted around the same time my videos saw their views drop off the face of the earth? Maybe. Maybe not. Who knows? What I do know is that things aren't exactly looking great for this channel at the moment. So I'm forced into a very embarrassing situation where I have to ask you guys if you'd be willing to help out. So if you find yourself with a few bucks in your pocket at the end of every month, I'd like to humbly request that you consider joining up over on Patreon or here with a YouTube membership. Doing so gets you access to my supporter-only Discord server, and you get to see these videos before they go live. I know that's not really a lot in terms of getting people excited about spending their hard-earned money, but to be real with you, I don't like the idea of paywalling content. As far as I'm concerned, this is a place where anyone can come to watch long-winded, annoying rants on old survival horror games for free, and it's gonna stay that way if it kills me. Oh, and before you type it out, let me beat you to the punch. Here we go, another rich YouTuber trying to talk his audience into funding his affluent lifestyle. So in the spirit of transparency, this is what the last 6 months of payments I received from all YouTube revenue sources combined look like. That's memberships, ad revenue, super chats, everything, all before taxes. I can assure you I'm not over here driving Bugattis off the lot. So if you feel like you received even the slightest bit of value from my content, I would appreciate a temporary helping hand until YouTube decides to correct course and stop pulling the rug out from under its own creators. Okay, so back to business. Combat. One of the core pillars of survival horror gameplay, and something that's both very simplistic and surprisingly hard to get right. The general idea is to make sure the player's always walking a thin line between being set up well enough to deal with possible combat scenarios, but making it so they really don't want to. And in that sense, I would say, while it was fairly bare bones, Tormented Souls Part 1 handled combat really well. It was a little different from the kinds of titles that put the genre on the map in the sense that enemies were so deadly and fast that in most scenarios, dealing with them instead of running away was the best move, if not wholly unavoidable. Which is fine because the game was balanced around this idea. In fact, on my first crack at it, I played fights a little fast and loose, using up way too much ammo, and for the first time since I was a teenager, I found myself stuck in a survival horror game because I was just flat out of resources. On my second attempt, I found a nice little strategy that made things far more manageable. A few shots with a gun to down the enemy, and then rushing up with a crowbar to deliver enough melee hits to finish them off. There was a dodge move you could utilize by hitting X while aiming, but to be honest, the method I leaned on for most of the game was effective enough that I was almost never forced to take advantage of it. and since I so rarely found myself in a situation where I would need to dodge, on the one-off occasion that it might have been useful, I was so rusty at its timing, I just end up eating a hit anyway. Like I said though, the combat in TS1, while far from complex, offered up precisely the kind of experience that fans of the classic genre greats would be looking for. And the same thing goes for Tormented Souls 2, for the most part. Your tried and true survival horror mechanics are just as well represented here as they were in the first game. You hold down the right trigger to aim and fire with the action button. Classic, functional, timeless. Instead of allowing for vertical aim adjustments, TS2 auto-aims at your target, which frees up the D-pad for moving around while you're readying attacks. Something I wasn't exactly yearning for in Part 1, but with the added mobility and long-range effectiveness of bad guys here in the sequel, it's all but necessary to take advantage of. Heading back to the first entry in the series though, if there is one complaint that I have retroactively after playing Part 2, it's that the game was pretty light on the arsenal. For most of the game, you had to make do with just the starting nail gun, a crowbar, and a shotgun, with an electric lance becoming accessible after you grabbed the flashlight. Not awful, but in terms of survival horror weaponry, it's kind of the bare minimum you'd want to see. And holy hell, is that an issue that's been well remedied here in the sequel. With Tormented Souls 2, you've got the returning roster of nailer, shotgun, and crowbar, which you'll love to see, but on top of that, you've also got an automatic nailer, an acid vial shooting crossbow, and a muzzle-loaded hand cannon that fires projectiles that can go through several enemies. Which would already be a stacked loadout on its own, but there's also new melee weapons in the form of a hammer, a gas-operated chainsaw modified to hold a circular blade, and the obnoxiously cool sledgehammer. A weapon that, given its massive recovery and wind-up time, is almost never a smart pick in combat, but was so damn awesome that I couldn't help but bust it out, even when it meant taking damage I could have otherwise avoided. And that's not a joke. I straight up brute forced a playstyle of soloing this big son of a bitch at my own detriment, and it couldn't have been more fun. Suffice it to say, the weapon lineup here in TS2 is nothing short of divine. I mean, not a single one of these things went unused for too long. In fact, it was kind of the opposite, because I'd switch up my arsenal every once in a while just to add a little spice to the combat. When I get bored with using the acid projectiles and the crowbar all the time, I'd switch it up with a combination of the automatic nailer and a hammer for a faster approach to fights. It makes for an absolutely killer variety of damage-dealing implements, and since the game has a pretty staggering number of unique monsters to fight, the urge and sometimes need to change your loadout stays fairly constant. Now on the other side of this, I will say that with so many potential weapons at your disposal, the typical genre tenet of really limiting the player's resources does suffer to a degree, but I think there's a balancing force at play here as well. Because just like the varied enemy roster, fluctuating ammo pools will also be forcing you to shift back and forth between your weapons. It seems to me the developers went into creating this stacked arsenal with the foreknowledge of how it would affect balance and really hunkered down to make sure that the game's other mechanics and systems stepped in to bring that back under control. And listen, I could definitely sit here and compliment how much I love these hacked together agents of violence made up of power tools and construction materials for easily another hour. But I haven't even gotten into the two best features of this game's combat yet. Two relatively small but important systems that make fights in this game just unreasonably fun. Now you might remember me talking about the dodge move in Tormented Souls 1 and how I never really felt the need to use it. Well, I'll go ahead and admit that bias did follow me into its sequel, at first. I probably played a good 2 or 3 hours without really giving it any thought, and to be honest, there's a good reason for that. I mean, on top of the fact that I was able to make it through the entire first game without ever touching it, a highly punishing survival horror game probably isn't the best setting to start testing out play mechanics in. Despite that though, you really should be messing around with this move as soon as you can because there's a little more to it than meets the eye. You don't really get a huge window of iframes to work with. It requires some tight reaction times and a good level of familiarity with the enemies you're fighting, so you're able to read their moves enough to know when and where to dodge. That being said, once you put in the time to learn it, hot damn is there no better feeling than pulling off a string of these maneuvers back to back. But of course, there is a more genre-appropriate reason to get comfortable with this dodge move as early as possible. See, the roaming mutations and living corpses in Tormented Souls 2 almost all pose a pretty serious threat to not just your health, but more importantly, your health-restoring resources. Now, of course, like any game in the genre, I was able to get to the end credits with a stockpile of healing items, but I don't think that would have been the case if I wouldn't have really locked in with the dodge system. From instant grabs to long-range caustic projectiles, this game's going to be throwing a lot of damage your way. And just relying on spacing and shooting like you would in any other survival horror game, it's not going to cut it for very long. And honestly, I'd call that a win-win, because not only do you get to experience the utter adrenaline spike of perfectly dodging an attack and countering with one of your own, but you also get to enter every new area confident that you've got the equivalent of a medium-sized pharmacy strapped to your waist in case things go wrong, which in this game isn't exactly an unlikely event.
How can he possibly resist the diabolical urge to push the button that could erase his very existence? Will his tortured mind give in to its uncontrollable desires?
And lastly, we're going to talk about what I would consider to be the glue that holds together everything we've discussed about the combat so far. Something you've likely already seen in action on screen countless times. And to explain it right, we're going to have to once again consult the title that started this series. Now, I already showed you my preferred and presumably the developer intended combat strategy in TS1, but let's watch it again real quick. Did you notice anything this time? 10 billion made up points to anyone who said, damn, that sure is not a seamless process. Each and every time I had to put a bad guy down, if I didn't want to needlessly waste ammunition, I would have to fire a few shots, run up to the downed enemy, open my inventory, navigate to the crowbar, select equip, close out of the inventory, beat the godless abomination to death, and depending on the situation, go back into my inventory so I can equip the gun again and reload it. It was something I made note of in my video covering Tormented Souls 1. Not exactly what I'd call a viable reason to ride in the streets, but enough of a bother for me to mention. And the sequel's answer to this little issue is honestly kind of genius. So let me ask you this. When playing a modern fixed camera survival horror game, what's the one part of the controller that never ever gets any use? Kudos to everybody who said the right thumbstick. That one little nub we all almost universally associate with camera operation. Now, since that thing's just sitting there unused anyway, developer Dual Effect figured they may as well combine these two problems to form one really simplistic but surprisingly effective solution. Heading into the inventory, you can highlight a weapon and assign it to a direction on the right thumbstick, giving you access to 4 hot swappable item slots. And truly, I can't describe how much more fluid this makes the combat feel compared to its predecessor. For hell, all kinds of both modern and retro survival horror titles. I mean, how many times have you been playing Code Veronica and switched between its OP as hell knife and your gun to save ammo in the early game? It really would have been nice to be able to do that while still controlling Claire. Now sure, there is a rational argument for that kind of clunkiness being a sort of baked-in feature of the genre. In fact, I'm almost positive I made it myself, but if a jaded, stuck-in-my-ways old head like me can use a feature like this and accept it as not taking away from the survival horror feel of the gameplay here, I'm sure anyone can. And since we are on the subject of this genre, which honestly is something you're never in danger of being too far from here on this channel, let's talk about the third pillar hanging up the pantheon that is survival horror: puzzles. Okay, so listen, I know this isn't exactly the most attractive subject for a video like this. I mean, everyone already knows these kinds of titles need to have a series of esoteric, interactive enigmas standing in between the player and the end screen, but talking about them doesn't exactly make for a riveting conversation. So I'm going to try my best not to linger too long on the subject, but I do have to say that these were some of the best examples of approachable, solvable puzzles I've probably ever come across in the genre. Just an impressively solid lineup of the kind of brain teasers that carefully tread the satisfying middle ground between challenging and frustrating. With each and every one of these things, I would find myself consciously impressed at how consistently they walked me through what I would call the 3 stages of survival horror puzzle solving: confusion, understanding, and then finally, celebration. Which is a concept I'm not sure I've ever actually spoken out loud before, so here's a bit of an explanation. See, at first, when you approach a puzzle in a survival horror title, there's a bit of apprehension, a small thought in the back of your head that says, wow, I have absolutely no idea what this thing is trying to get me to do. That's the confusion. But then, as you start to unravel the developer's intention, your thoughts begin to flow along the same lines as the logic of the puzzle itself: understanding. Usually, or at least in my case, you'll stay in this stage for a while as you build up momentum by figuring out smaller aspects of the puzzle which unlock a little more of its shape inside of your head. After this, you eventually arrive at the solution, which is obviously where the celebration takes place. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, that usually looks something like this. And I think the key to the puzzles in Tormented Souls 2 doing such a great job of hitting all 3 of these benchmarks is the almost perfect level of balance they seem to maintain. Some of them were definitely harder or more easy than others, but from my perspective, they never sank to the level of patronizing me. Each one of these head scratchers would give me a good jolt of electricity to the old brain, but they didn't have me sitting and thinking for so long that the flow of the gameplay needed to come to a complete stop. And that's a really tough place to stay in for a survival horror game, especially one with such a massive runtime and so many puzzles. I was also really impressed by how many of these things had a few different layers of complexity to them, which is something that the first game also excelled at. Now, your typical fan of the genre is going to be well acquainted with the old grab X item and shove it into Y object type of case, and to be sure, both Tormented Souls 1 and 2 have these kinds of puzzles in them. But I would say the majority of mental challenges you come across are going to require some form of genuine investigation, which means hopping into your inventory and getting a little hands-on with some of your stuff, like combining items together to make some sort of a tool or read something that's on them, or popping the cover off of a piece of electronics to swap out some batteries. This level of hands-on manipulation of the key items in your possession always felt to me a little more like the kind of mechanic you might find in a point-and-click adventure game. And since it already is my personal opinion that survival horror as a genre is just a sort of branch off the old PC point-and-click tree, that's really appropriate. Of course, there are classic titles in the genre that take advantage of a similar type of inventory-level interaction. Think something like needing to open the books of the Wolf and the Eagle in Resident Evil 1, but I would argue literally no one does it quite so often as Tormented Souls, and they certainly don't do it as well. I kind of feel like this sort of deeper level inventory management takes a layer of the abstraction away from the game, making puzzles feel almost like something you're actually messing with in real life. On top of that though, like I said before, it adds an oh so important extra layer of complexity. So even when the mystery that you've come across has a fairly easy solution, needing to manipulate a few items around, combine them together, or search them for hidden clues makes it feel like you've done a lot more than what was actually accomplished. Really, I can't compliment Tormented Souls 2 enough for its tough but fun puzzle design. It contributes immensely to that authentic feeling of the survival horror gameplay it offers, but outside of that, they're just entertaining as hell to sit down and think your way through. And I'm proud to say that I blasted through the entire game's arsenal of mind-bogglers without ever looking up a guide. Well, except for the chess puzzle, which I don't count because chess puzzles are basically cheating. Look, I don't know a thing about chess, I don't want to know a thing about chess, and I damn sure am not going to be taking a crash course in its intricacies just to continue enjoying a video game that is 99.9% not about chess. So from here on out, if you're working on a survival horror title, just know that if you put a chess-based psychological hurdle in it, I'm not even going to entertain the idea of solving it myself. I'm just going to type the name of your game into Google, followed by the words chess puzzle solution. Alright, so by now I'm guessing you guys have received the intended message. Tormented Souls 2 has got some award-worthy gameplay. In a world where somehow the genre of survival horror has seen a T-Virus-esque resurrection from the dead, competition can be stiff. Okay, so here's the thing. I didn't mean to say stiff right after dead and resurrection. That would have been the funniest joke ever, and I wish that I could have written it on purpose instead of realizing it while I'm voicing it to you, the microphone. Anyway, even when you compare it to the outright classics that have been released in the last few years, TS2 in particular stands out as a beautiful note among a genuinely awesome chorus. That being said, those of you who have been around the channel for a while, you'll know that nothing is so great that I won't go out of my way to criticize it. And thanks to my absolutely scarring experience with Silent Hill F, the thing closest to my mind is how often TS2 actually crashed on me. Although I will clarify that I figured out what was causing the problem eventually. Apparently the game doesn't like it when you alt-tab out of it, which is probably going to be easy for your average user to avoid, but since I need to switch to a Google Doc for my notes and to annotate capture files so I can find footage when I'm editing, that's a fairly big issue for me. Luckily, I was able to notice that things are fine if you only have it running in the background for a short amount of time. But if you're spending more than a few minutes on something else in Windows, you got a pretty good chance of seeing the game crash. And I think it's good we started with this one because just about everything that's going to follow will slot into that same technical issue class of complaint. For example, I found two spots where Caroline can go out of bounds, one in the cemetery and the other in the area connecting the church to the monastery. I was also a little perplexed by the fact that the quick turn function gets taken away when you enter dark areas. It's an established mechanic that staying in total darkness for too long will take you out in these games, but it seems weird to take away the player's best maneuver for quickly exiting a bad situation in exactly the kind of scenario where it would be most useful. I mean, to be fair, it's not like I died because of this or anything, but it does feel like a kind of odd decision if it was on purpose. Getting back into the obviously unintended problems though, I found that exiting the inventory while holding forward would sometimes cause Caroline to take these tiny baby steps. It's like the input was being repeated instead of being held down. Like I said, this didn't happen all the time, but because I was most likely to trip this specific series of events during boss fights, it did make a disproportionately negative impression on me. And last but not least, I also ran into a bug near the end of the game where I was supposed to sit in total darkness to proceed forward. The only problem was that something hitched up with the game and it never registered that I was in the dark. I mean, the screen did go black and everything, but it failed to trigger the state that told the game to start a countdown to my death. I ran around this area for like 20 minutes thinking there was some source of light that I needed to snuff out or something, but after exiting and re-entering the room, everything worked fine. I'll be honest with you guys, I do tend to be a little more lenient with indie developed titles like this when it comes to bugs. I mean, these aren't teams that have tons of money and or manpower to throw into thoroughly playtesting every single square inch of in-game real estate at every step of development. So at least in my opinion, everything that I just talked about, while kind of annoying, doesn't really cross the divide into genuine criticism. Because they were in the game though, I did feel obligated to mention them, but I don't think slight hiccups like this are anywhere near substantial enough that they should be scaring anybody away from this game. Especially because what you're all looking at right now is one of the best gameplay experiences I have had in years. Really and truly, some of the best survival horroring, I guess, that I've done in recent memory, which for a guy that essentially plays these games for a living, that means a lot. It's a title that is flat out massive, both in terms of its runtime and content, and it's nothing short of impressive how well it produces something that simultaneously stays strict in its adherence to the genre, but also is wholly unique as well. And since this is the second time that I felt this way about a game with the title Tormented Souls, I think we can safely say Dual Effect has established this as a genuine and honest benchmark of a franchise. You know, I think the best way to describe this to an audience of people like myself, that being degenerates who only understand the world in terms of old PS1 games and tank controls, is like this. If Tormented Souls is Resident Evil 1 in the way that it sets up a rough but solid gameplay style and formula, then its sequel is obviously Resident Evil 2. The scope has been expanded, the settings scaled up, and the established gameplay mechanics solidified. Not so much is altered that it ends up feeling like a wholly different experience, but just the right amount. That mythical perfect middle ground between improvement and consistency. It's a sequel that was able to sharpen nearly every ounce of content that the original provided, but in a way that stays firmly authentic to that initial outing, making it feel like a recognizably organic growth straight upwards from an origin point and not some new evolution using the first game as an inspiration. So here's hoping we're all able to meet back up right here when I'm able to compare some future sequel in the series to RE6 as the entire universe folds in on itself. Until that day though, I have only one piece of advice. Go right now and play Tormented Souls 2. Before we start talking about TS2's story, I've got to warn you guys, there's going to be a lot of spoilers for the first game ahead, so if you want to avoid that, I'd say just go ahead and skip this section altogether. And for everyone still left over, how about a quick summary of everything that brought us here? The first Tormented Souls introduced us to Caroline, a young woman who was minding her own business when out of nowhere she receives a postcard with a picture of twins on it and "You think you can just abandon us here" written on the back, which in the things you don't want to get in the mail tier list ranks fairly high. But upon looking at the image, Caroline starts to get these crazy headaches, and even after putting the letter away, she finds that her thoughts keep drifting back to it. So she packs up and heads off to the return address on the postcard and finds herself in the Wildberger Hospital where she's almost immediately knocked out. After waking up basically fine, with the exception of a missing highball, Caroline starts to unravel her long-forgotten history with this place. It turns out that she was actually one of the twins depicted on the postcard that she received. And she goes on to discover, as a 10-year-old, Caroline and her twin sister were taken by their grandfather to be sacrificed to a god that he and his fellow cult members believed could only be resurrected by taking out a set of twins in some kind of ritual. Just before that plan became a reality, though, their mother intervened and attempted to escape with the girls in tow. However, during the trek, the cult was able to catch up with the trio, causing Caroline to fall into a river. Thinking one half of his potential sacrifice was dead, the cult leader grandfather saw no use for the remaining sister and threw her into a cell to essentially rot for the rest of her life. As Caroline makes her way further into the mansion/hospital, I think she might be a co-owner of, she discovers that the god that she was supposed to be sacrificed to is actually still under the building. So to make sure this never happens to anyone again, she goes about the process of making the thing past tense. Now, I'll be honest, this next part I've always been kind of fuzzy on, because Caroline somehow has the ability to walk through images of the past like VHS recordings, essentially time traveling and affecting the events of the present. Now, I'm not about to say that that's any more or less crazy than an eldritch god hanging out underground eating dead twins, but it's just that the game never really explained why she can do this. Or at least I wasn't able to find any explanation. Regardless of how she's able to do it though, with this newfound power, Caroline enters a projection of the cell holding her young sister and brings her into the present, rescuing her from a future where she becomes a mutated science experiment. And I think that just about brings us current. Tormented Souls 2 starts out with Caroline and her newly found sister Anna on a train heading to a small village in Chile. The reason being Anna's recent propensity for falling into a trance state and drawing things that are a little too creepy, which is a setup I imagine is going to sound fairly familiar to a lot of you. Apparently, Isabella, a nun that raised Caroline and now acts as a friend and caretaker for the sisters, recommended that they visit a convent to help Anna with her problem. Okay, so by the way, I'm Cuban, and it's really hard for me to say Anna. That's not in my vocabulary, even though that's how her name is pronounced in the game, so you're probably going to hear me switch between the two a lot as I subconsciously pronounce it the way that I'm used to versus how, I guess, everybody else does. Apologies for that ahead of time. Now back to the matter at hand, how any place on Earth could specialize in a problem so specific, I'll never know, but that's what we're working with. After the two arrive at the religious equivalent of a sorority house, they decide to rest up, but at some point during their nap, the nun snuck in and took Anna away. See, I did it immediately right afterwards. Anna, that's really tough for me, I'm not joking.
Anna! Anna! Where are you?
Caroline wakes up, understandably freaks out, and chases down the screams of her twin sister until stumbling onto whatever the hell this is. It turns out that the person running this place, Mother Lucia, is well aware of their real identities as the Wildberger twins and is a part of the cult that originally tried to sacrifice them. So it's ritual killing part 2, electric boogaloo for Caroline, as she once again finds herself losing consciousness at the start of a Tormented Souls game.
You belong to us.
Upon waking up looking more like a pincushion than a person, she sets off on her second adventure to save her sister, which, just like the first, has a fairly satisfying amount of twists and turns to it. And that's not where the similarities end, because my feelings on this story are almost an exact mirror of how I felt about part 1. In my opinion, both are a bit of a mixed bag, but I think that might be more on me than any sort of writing chops on the developer's end. Personally, I tend to lean more towards the comparably grounded narratives you'd find in early Resident Evil games, which include events that are pretty fantastical but have a basis in the kind of things that a regular person would be familiar with. Corrupt corporations, foregoing moral values for profit margins, and the kind of mishaps that can lead to when a lot of money and secrecy are mixed with genetic research. Yeah, I know what you're thinking already, and I am a massive Silent Hill fan, but at the risk of being really bad at my job, I can't really describe what it is about SH's storytelling that elevates it above my aforementioned bias. That being said, narratively speaking, there's tons of great stuff going on in Tormented Souls 2. For example, I really appreciate how it expands on characters who were only mentioned in the first title, making them a driving force behind the events that are playing out right now. And on the other side of the coin, to keep the story from feeling like a flat-out retread of the same ground, we've also got brand new characters to engage with who weren't involved with the previous game's events.
And what exactly are you gonna do?
Whatever it takes, of course.
Just like TS1, you can't expect the game to throw a pretty big twist at you halfway through, and I will admit I was caught off guard by it. I was also a really big fan of Part 2 revealing more of its story through cutscenes and character interaction. I mean, obviously, I am a big fan of the genre's well-known storytelling method of finding notes, journal entries, and newspaper clippings, but it's good to balance that against some good old-fashioned two-way conversation as well. And on that note, I think it's going to be really hard for someone to come from Tormented Souls 1 and not notice what a massive upgrade to the voice acting its sequel has received. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, there are still a few rough deliveries and hokey lines, but on the whole, this...
Listen, now that I think you're crazy, you may as well tell me the whole story.
Hush now. There's nothing you need to say. You've given it all here today. Nobody can ask any more of you than that.
Is way easier to listen to than this.
What the hell is going on here?
My child, you are pale. What happened to you?
Of course I'll help. Stay calm, okay? Everything will be all right. I promise.
So yeah, we could definitely call that an improvement, but there's still some stuff going on here that seems a little out of place. For example, the story introduces us to this guy Joseph, who's described in all the wiki articles as a local warlock, which gets me wondering how one goes about attaining that kind of a title. Like, is there an application process, or do I have to go through some sort of a test? This is genuinely something I thought about. That aside though, by the end of the game, I was left trying to figure out what kind of a role he actually played in the story. Because for a while, he's the only living person you get to talk to, which sort of gives him an elevated spot in the narrative. And as you continue to come across him, you keep finding him just chilling next to these dead bodies. Each time he says it was self-defense, and like, sure, there are roaming ghouls in this place, so it's not unreasonable he would have to knock a few off the same way Caroline has. But if that is the case, why are they never the kinds of enemies that we ever encounter? He always makes it a point to claim self-defense, but after so many cases in the same 24-hour period, I'm ready to start considering the possibility there's a little more at play. But therein lies the problem. See, they introduced this guy Joseph, give him a lot of screen time, set up this mystery concerning him possibly being some kind of a serial killer, but without spoiling anything, he's just sort of yeeted out of the story and left with zero impact on anything that happened here. Now, just before and after he's gone, you do find some info letting you know what his true intentions were, but it's just this entire off-screen side story that didn't really need to be there in my opinion. Sadly, the same thing goes for Miguel. When this guy first showed up, I was all kinds of curious as to what the hell he was doing there. And to the game's credit, that does end up getting explained pretty well, but once again, it's a really big side story that, while justifying his presence in the town, fails to justify the reason he's in the story. I mean, besides being a necessary step in getting the game's good ending, Miguel plays no role in any of the events here. He has nothing to do with the whole God resurrection thing, and he never really steps in to make himself a major player in the resulting story events. At the very least, I can say the inclusion of Sister Isabella is warranted given her previous ties to the Wildberger tragedy, but she suffers nearly the same fate as Joseph in the sense that she ends up unceremoniously exiting the picture without contributing much outside of a single plot revelation. Now, if I'm being honest, I'm no Shakespeare on my best day writing these scripts, so I'm not an expert in any sense, but it sort of feels to me like the game had this really strong core narrative that could have worked on its own, but felt the need for a few additional plot threads to give off the image of a more robust story. It's like if you added a few support pillars to your house, but you built them in your backyard. Like, sure, they are there and they may look good at a glance, but they aren't exactly performing any sort of structural duty. And if anything, it just makes it more annoying to mow your lawn. I'm willing to admit I may have lost the thread of that analogy somewhere along the way. I think I might have been a little too hard on this game's story, and maybe there's a good reason for that. It seems to me this is the kind of tale that'll keep you perfectly following along and entertained as you experience it, but sort of falls apart under the kind of close scrutiny that comes with analysis after the fact. Because it really did have me by the nose while I was playing the game. At the time, I was fully down for the kind of story it was weaving, outside of my preference for the less fanciful elements. I mean, the characters felt relatable to me, and while Anna didn't have much time to be developed well enough for me to care about her myself, I spent enough hours with Caroline that I wanted her to be rescued by proxy alone. Really, the issues only came about as I would look back on the events of the narrative with the context of the full picture in mind. That might be a tough concept to wrestle with, but I think I would describe this game as having the kind of story that's at its best when it's slowly unraveling itself to you and not when you sit back to analyze it later. Because like I said, as I played the game, I was fully invested. It was only the act of writing this script that had me thinking about it as a mixed bag. So try and keep that in mind for later, because I really did have a lot of fun with this game's story. Speaking of which, one of the standout additions to TS2's story was the parts concerning the Villa Hesse, the town that the convent's located in. In a very Spencer Mansion or Raccoon City sort of sense, as you explore this place, you'll begin coming across personal accounts of its descent into hell. At first, there's a physical, sort of grounded component to it, and then the church starts playing a role in the eventual downfall of the place, and that really kept me engaged. I'm not sure I'll ever be able to explain why, but getting to read the musings of people involved in a small, localized apocalypse event is always going to be interesting to me. And the story of this village's brush with the end times is particularly fun to unravel. I think it also helps that you're often getting your information out of chronological order, so you may come across some kind of personal anecdote about how bad things have become for a specific villager, and then hours later some diary entry that describes the events leading up to that micro story. It makes for a really cool experience where you're coming across small pieces of a puzzle, and just by the nature of interest alone, keeping parts of it in your memory ready to be triggered when something related to it comes up later on down the line. In terms of the main story, it's really nice to have Caroline recap major events at save points once you've made a set amount of progress.
I knew it. I knew Lucia was behind all of this. She's done something to my sister.
I mean, with how long I spent playing this thing, the last issue I would complain about is a few reminder sessions catching me up with everything that's happened recently. All in all, this was a pretty good story in my opinion. It might stray off into a realm I don't enjoy quite as much as other offerings in the genre, but I can't really say that I have any substantial complaints about its content outside of personal taste. The tale here does a great job of not just being a worthy follow-up to its predecessor, but in my opinion surpassing it in nearly every way. Now, in fairness, I did find Part 1's story to be by far its weakest attribute, so I guess take that how you will. That being said, the story here is perfectly entertaining. It's a great little horror romp, and even though it's not my preferred cup of tea, I can still recognize how well it kept me invested over its 15-hour length. A little gun safety lesson though, if you decided not to shoot a person, do me a favor and don't rack around into the chamber while the thing's pointed right at their face. Because in a situation when you're not trying to get a really nice view of what's happening inside of their brain cavity, that's a great way of accomplishing the opposite of that goal.
Now please, take that fucking gun out of my face.
Sorry.
In terms of presentation, I feel like the first Tormented Souls game punched way above its weight in a lot of ways. Instead of using pre-rendered backgrounds like a lot of its genre cohorts, it opted for fully 3D environments that were so incredibly pristine and beautiful that it would be pretty damn easy to think they weren't being rendered in real time. And because of this decision, Caroline's character model fit right into her surroundings, which made for an overall impressive, but even more importantly, cohesive picture. And you can go ahead and take everything I just said and apply it to part 2 as well, because it's all still very much the case. I mean, most aspects of the picture have seen baffling leaps forward in terms of fidelity, but we're still dealing with pretty much all the same compliments. Now, I would have never called the first game's environments undetailed or lacking in set dressing, because they certainly weren't, but with how great the sequel's offerings look, it does sort of make TS1 retroactively less impressive. In fact, as I drooled over these just knockout backgrounds, one thing kept repeating in my head. It was like a feeling, but it was hard to nail down, like a vague sense of familiarity. I think when I sat down to write this script, though, I finally got a lock on it. Alright, so this is going to sound kind of weird, but take the Resident Evil 1 remake on the GameCube. Now think of it not as you know it now, but as your nostalgic, young memory kept it inside of your head. That almost perfect depiction of real life being pushed through the filter of a CRT's phosphorescent glow. Well, that's what this game's presentation looks like to me. I don't know, it just seems perfectly in line with the look achieved by Mikami's second shot at RE1. And despite the survival horror genre being just flooded with titles recently, that kind of a photorealism-centric approach is still a relatively rare practice. I mean, don't think of this for even a second as a complaint, but most titles nowadays do tend to chase a retro, low-poly type of aesthetic. Off the top of my head, the only games I could think of that stray from the PS1-inspired side of things and aim more at current-gen PC graphics would be The Mute House and Echoes of the Living. So it's not really all that often I get to see that RE1 remake and RE0 kind of look in a modern RE-like. Which is both worth pointing out and praising in and of itself. And I know what you're thinking, he's definitely going to stop complimenting these real-time environments now. Which no, I'm not. They're pure beauty. Everything from their layout and lighting to their animations is just top notch in every sense of the term. I'm being genuine and honest when I say that there were countless moments during this playthrough where I would just stop moving around and admire how amazing my surroundings looked. And just like Tormented Souls 1, the backgrounds here may not be pre-rendered, but they look so amazing I could very well be fooled into thinking they are. That being said, with your environments not being made up of several 2D images, we do get certain benefits, like fully animated flourishes, real-time shadow casting, and most importantly, one of my absolute favorite types of survival horror camera systems, the kind that allows for both static placements and sections where the view can shift and move with the character on a fixed track. When I first saw this combination used together in Resident Evil Code Veronica, I remember thinking to myself that it might be the most important evolution the genre will ever see, and if I'm being honest, that's still the case today. Because when these two coexist within the same game, you get all of the upsides of meticulously placed stationary camera angles, along with the kind of dynamic feeling that comes with a moving perspective. You really can't deny how important artfully handled fixed camera angles are to survival horror as a genre, but it's not like a mobile approach to the camera doesn't also have its positives. They're two great systems that, despite their polar opposite functions, somehow work even better together. And listen, I would really love to stop talking about this game's 3D environments and move on to something else, but there's a lot about TS2's presentation that sort of revolves around the topic. For example, both Tormented Souls 1 and 2 include darkness and small light sources in their gameplay mechanics, and as such, solid lighting is not only a nice way to make the games look better, but it's also kind of baked into their general game design. It's very rare for you to run into an area that's lit well on its own. Most of the time, you're going to be relying on either Caroline's lighter or the flashlight you get about 8 hours in. And I would say this is a source of two of my favorite parts of the game's graphical arsenal. On one end, the ability to cast perspective-correct shadows onto the environment is just pristine, and it plays a large role in Part 2's general aesthetic, a fact that's made all the more apparent in the very few scenes where there are enough bright, multi-directional light sources that shadows are almost non-existent. I mean, look at how moody and creepy this looks compared to this. But the second reason the whole lighting thing is so integral is a bit counterintuitive, because a big part of what makes Tormented Souls 2 look so damn good is the large portions of the environment you actually can't see. Now, darkness is something that's not very often handled well in video games, and for understandable reasons. I mean, if you made your money designing environments, you'd probably want the player to actually see the fruits of your labor for a large portion of the time. But this game takes a very different approach, one that I really appreciate. Like I already said, most places you explore in this Chilean village are going to be incredibly dark, and oftentimes you're not going to be able to see very much more than the small circle of illumination that comes from your lighter. And I can't even begin to tell you how effective this is in terms of the game's horror, immersion, and overall atmosphere. There's just something so damn powerful about not being able to see what's around you that makes each room in the game stressful as hell to be in, which in a funny way actually works counter to the logic and reason of your conscious mind. Because it won't take very long for most people to figure out that the game will start playing a music sting when enemies are near, and that rooms you've already cleared very rarely repopulate with threats. However, despite that, not being able to see what's around you keeps tensions high even in places you're fairly sure contain zero actual dangers. Most importantly to me though, it makes for an incredibly impressive image. The harsh, inky black shadows both cast and eliminated by the game's gloomy, almost foggy light sources combine together to form one of the most visually pleasing presentations I've ever seen in one of these types of games. Of course, this might be thanks to a very specific bias of mine. I can't properly figure out why this is, but I've just always been heavily partial to the kind of dynamic shadows and lighting that were popular in the mid-2000s and early 2010s. I can still remember seeing a tech demo for Doom 3 and thinking its approach to real-time lighting was the best thing to come around since 3D accelerator cards. What specifically got me going was that the shadows had these really sharp, defined lines to them, instead of the more realistic dispersal you'd see in shadows cast in the real world. To me, it's a stylistic thing. I mean, sure, modern-day ray-traced light sources create more accurate-looking shadows that have realistic, gradient-heavy boundaries, and without a doubt, that can look incredible. But I'm just always going to prefer the more harsh look of something like this. The dark areas of the screen in TS2 are almost impenetrably black, and the light sources take on a foggy, almost hazy look. Kinda like the darkness is the real powerhouse here, and it's the lights that are struggling to exist inside of it. And it's actually here where I notice something that has nothing to do with the game itself and more with the process of me capturing footage. Which I'll go ahead and warn you guys up front, this is going to be one of those times where I get way too technical with stuff that only like 3 of you are going to care about. So feel free to nod off for the next little bit. Okay, so I use OBS and NVIDIA's Shadowplay to capture footage of the games that I cover here on the channel. And while I am still learning the nuances of these two apps, I'd like to think I have a good idea of how compression can affect video quality. But Tormented Souls 2 was able to teach me something I didn't know before. With the 16 hours of captured footage I amassed for this project, I hit over 500 gigs, which definitely isn't small, but there's a reason for that. I really enjoy pointing out video features and flaws, which often has me zooming in really close to show off specific elements. And even when I don't, I like to have a very high quality image on screen so that any of the small graphical tidbits I talk about can be easily seen, even after YouTube's video compression mangles the file so you can watch it. That being said, higher quality means bigger file sizes, and I don't have petabytes at my disposal for game capture, so I try to strike a balance that favors perceived visual quality over compression rates, which nets me just about a gigabyte per minute captured on average, and in most scenarios, that's about as close to lossless as I can get without filling every hard drive within a square mile of my house. Tormented Souls 2, however, just so happens to be made up of mostly the exact situation that shows the flaws of not capturing true lossless video. And bear with me here because I'm not exactly sure if I'll be able to show an example on screen without YouTube's compression sort of ruining the point of showing it. So here are two still images. One is a direct, raw screenshot taken from Tormented Souls 2, and the other is taken from one of my fairly hefty video captures. At first, both of them seem exactly the same, right? Well, let's zoom in. See how the video capture side shows a wild amount of color banding? Well, that happens when applying compression to shades of color that have complex gradients. And as you can imagine, in a game that includes mostly dark rooms with small sources of illumination surrounded by light coronas, that's going to show up everywhere in my footage. The only way to get rid of the banding would be to capture video at a bit rate that would equal out to something like 2 gigabytes for every second recorded, and even then I couldn't really count on the same effect not occurring when the video is uploaded and re-encoded by YouTube. So the overall point of this rant is twofold. One, Tormented Souls 2 looks a lot better than what I can show you here. And two, if you are the kind of person who enjoys recording video game footage as a hobby or for content creation, remember it's not just the resolution you capture at. There's all kinds of elements to keep in mind. Bitrate, a 444 versus 422 versus 420 color space, and even file containers. They're all going to play a significant role in the kind of quality you can expect. And yes, I can tell that I've put most of you to sleep by now. So let's go ahead and get back on track for however long it takes me to go off on another unrelated tangent. Back when I covered the first Tormented Souls game, one of the critiques I had was that character models and especially faces had an unnaturally smooth sort of look. Kind of like all the skin in the game was made from porcelain. It wasn't exactly a massive problem, but it was certainly something that took my attention away from the actual content I was supposed to be paying attention to. And I'm happy to say that this issue has been fixed in part 2. Sure, they aren't the most well-rendered faces I've ever seen, but by comparison, they've definitely seen some very noticeable improvements. I mean, skin actually looks like skin now, which is great. That being said, just like the first entry in the series, it looks like the lion's share of the work went into modeling and texturing just about everything that isn't skin. And honestly, that's fine. I mean, in reality, for every 20 seconds you spend getting an up-close view of someone's face in a cutscene, you can expect about half an hour of looking at items, weapons, or the environment. So on closer inspection, those priorities seem to be pretty well thought out. But since I did just bring them up for a microsecond, I do want to spend a bit of time talking about how much I love these implements of destruction. One thing I really enjoyed about Tormented Souls was how each of the weapons Caroline gets her hands on had this hacked together, jerry-rigged kind of look. It was something that made the game really stand out visually, and that exact same aesthetic has made its way into the sequel, which is something I couldn't be happier about. I mean, not only is it great seeing Part 2 keep up the original's unique visual identity, but outside of that, they just look cool as shit. Instead of coming across the expected genre fare of maybe a pistol or machine gun, every weapon you find in this South American village is going to look like something put together with whatever a person may have had on hand at the time. And this improvised, homemade approach to weapon design results in one of the absolute coolest rosters of damage-dealing armaments I've ever seen in one of these games. You could truly spend a good hour just looking at these things, and you continue finding little details you never noticed before. Looking back, I guess, I didn't really need to spend quite so much time on this section of the video because, unlike the story or the gameplay, you can just glance up at the screen every so often and see for yourself just how amazing this game looks. It's got artistry, detail-oriented design, atmosphere, style, and the entire package is wrapped in an aura that, for lack of a better term, just feels like it came from the heart. Like it was a visual package someone really wanted to make and not some overworked 3D modeler clocking in to nab a quick paycheck. Hell, you could probably tell how much love went into this thing just from the amount of homages scattered throughout the game. I'm not sure I found all of them, but off the top of my head, there were 2 dedicated to Resident Evil, 1 for Silent Hill, and if I'm right, this one seems to be a nod to that introductory scene from Alone in the Dark. You know, the game that people in my comments section seem to think I don't know exists. So yeah, nothing to critique here, just a great looking game made by people who really seem to love the process of making it.
Psych!
Nah, I'm just fucking with you guys. You know there's no title so perfect I won't pop off at least a couple of petty complaints. And we'll go ahead and start with the most genuine one. Facial animations can be very, very hit or miss.
This place smells old. You said it was gonna be a bougie little health spa.
Now, to be fair, they are leagues above what could be found in Part 1, but that doesn't mean they're without issue. Anna just looks flat out weird. No matter what scene she's in, it always feels like she's got the worst animations in the room. Caroline, for some reason, just never closes her mouth, which seems to be more of an issue in the cutscenes where she's screaming or in a lot of pain. On the plus side though, this problem seems to only apply to dialogue-based animations because when she's not talking, her face can be very effectively expressive. Going back and watching my footage, I found that Mother Lucia's lip syncing just flat out doesn't line up with her voice, but it's not in a way that'll be super noticeable most of the time.
We wish only to guide you to your destiny.
Miguel's face, on the other hand, animates really well, probably the second best looking facial animations in the game. But here's the wild thing. The entire reason I'm even talking about an indie game's kind of janky but inoffensive animation work. By far, the most impressive character you'll see in the 11 to 15 hour experience that is Tormented Souls 2 is actually Sister Angelica, a nun at the convent who shows up, I'm almost positive, just 2 times. And when I say that her face animates really well, I'm not talking about in the context of this game, but like in general. She looks amazingly convincing. Her eyebrows, lips, and eyelids all move so fluidly that I would think this was some sort of a test animation for a Pixar movie or something. And I'm not joking, her performances are incredible. I'm not really sure why this almost throwaway character got so much attention from the animation department, but if we could get a couple more Sister Angelicas in the next game, I think we'll have one hell of a winner on our hands. Moving on to far less important things, we've got an issue that I'm not too sure I can blame on the developers. Not always, but sometimes when the camera angles change, you'll get what seems like a single frame of the last angle just sort of thrown in there randomly. According to a few people in game development that I've talked to, this is an issue with Unreal Engine, and with how negative my experiences with that trash fire have been lately, I'm more than willing to believe it. Along those same lines, I found a few instances of texture pop-in where the low-res textures will load in what seems like a full second before the high-res ones. On the plus side, this seems to be limited to cutscenes and it doesn't show up in all of them, so it's not exactly a problem, but more like the kind of thing that only a psycho would bring up. Well, that or a YouTuber, but I repeat myself. And finally, I sort of wish it were possible to toggle off the indicator that shows up when you switch weapons. I mean, don't get me wrong, I actually did need the reminder of what was equipped to which direction most of the time, but if there's one thing you should know about me, it's that I'm willing to forgo a lot of usability just to achieve a visually immersive, uninterrupted game screen. Little pop-ups and UI style elements just kind of get on my nerves in survival horror games, so it'd be nice if I could toggle them off whenever possible. But outside of a collection of critiques you could probably better classify as things that struck me as interesting, Tormented Souls 2 is a knockout punch visually speaking. Expecting this level of fidelity from indie developers is sort of outrageous, so when we actually get it, I think a bit of acknowledgement and celebration is due. Well guys, there we have it. Tormented Souls 2 clears the bar in just about every single way conceivable. It provides one hell of an experience that looks, plays, and performs excellently. More than a love letter, it's like an entire-ass marriage proposal to old-school, brick-and-mortar, true blue survival horror. And I'll be damned if it wasn't one of the most fun horror games I've put my hands on in a very long time. Which is great for two reasons. Of course, there's the overall good it does for the scene. I mean, we fans of the genre have been eating well lately, and I'm more thankful for that than anyone will ever know, but every once in a while, we need something like this to come around and raise the bar for everyone else. Something that gives developers a new high point to aim for. But aside from that, I kind of needed this one to be amazing. Like I said at the start of this video, Tormented Souls 1 was the title that picked me up and carried me across the metaphorical threshold of this new genre revival, and it would be incredibly disappointing for its follow-up to come around and not blow my socks off. So it would be fair to say that I came into this one with higher expectations than most. Expectations that I never in a million years would have predicted would be exceeded to this degree. Honestly, I'm not even sure what else I can say. I mean, there's so much of this title left to compliment, I don't even know where to start. I can tell you this though. At the moment, Tormented Souls 2 is my game of the year. And unless the survival horror development community has some absolute heat headed my way in the near future, I'd say that's a spot that'll be nearly impossible to surpass. Thank you, Dual Effect, for showing a very clear and respectable dedication to your craft and to anyone else who slaves away making survival horror games. I was once totally ready to write off my favorite genre, already had a plot picked out to bury it in and everything. But now I've got a backlog as long as my leg of these things, and truly, I could not be more happy about it. And speaking of which, I've got to get to work on the next one, so here's hoping I see you all then. But until that day, as usual, I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews. Alright guys, thank you so much for sticking around. If you enjoy the content that I make here, maybe think about joining up on Patreon or here as a YouTube member to support more of it. I am eternally grateful to the names that are scrolling on the screen right now, and because of that, I endeavor to answer every single question any of them ever ask me, so let's get on with that.
Are you a big reader? What other hobbies do you have?
I wouldn't necessarily say I'm a big reader because dyslexia makes that kind of hard for me to do, but I do listen to a lot of books. For the most part, I'll be honest, it's a lot of zombie trash novels, but on top of that, I really enjoyed The Road and the Metro series.
Have you ever considered reviewing TLOU 2? If not, why? I've always been curious because of how much you praised the first game. Cheers! Thanks for the awesome content.
I 110% want to, and I intend on doing it at some point, but I gotta level with you. That first video took me about 2.5 months to finish all in, and it was incredibly expensive because I had to buy so many ports of the game. And really, I want to approach the second game in the same way, so I need to make sure I've got a really clear schedule and a few extra bucks in the bank. It'll for sure happen though, I promise.
I once saw a Land of the Dead poster in a photo that you put in a video in your pre-Japan era. If we'll never get a review, quick thoughts, I love it by the way. Also, there is a game there, just waiting to be covered.
Man, I really wish you wouldn't have said you liked it, because now I feel bad, because I kind of hate it a little bit. I really don't like zombie movies where the zombies start figuring things out, they start communicating or using weapons. That always bothers me. That being said, the movie does have some great characters and some genuinely cool writing in a lot of spots, but I think as a whole, it's a little too hokey for me. On the subject of The Road to Fiddler's Green, it is trash, and I admit that, but I also admit that there's something kind of not fun necessarily, but it's got something I do enjoy. Also, a really old favorite death metal band of mine, Brain Drill, used a sample from its intro in one of their songs, so now it's stuck in my head like you wouldn't believe.
As long as we're alive, they ain't never gonna run out of food. The day they do, it'll mean only one thing. We're all dead.
Chronos review when?
Very soon, I promise. At the moment, I'm working on another Resident Evil clone video, and potentially after that. I don't know, I'm working on a Max Payne thing too. Things are a little tricky right now.
What's your personal perfect game that, if only one thing was different, would have been a disaster?
Damn, I don't know, that's a tough one. Let me see. I might go with Castlevania Symphony of the Night. I think that game is such a perfect combination of elements that even a single one being in a different spot would completely ruin it. The story, the music, the gameplay, the sprite work, all of it needs to be exactly how it is, or maybe it wouldn't have turned me on to Metroidvanias at all.
Besides Japanese, are there any other languages you would like to focus on learning?
I think once I get really comfortable with Japanese, I would like to brush back up on Spanish because I've forgotten so much of what I grew up with. But after that, I think all the time I've spent in Stalker, I sort of have to learn Russian, or the Ukrainian dialect of it, or however that works. Either way, I would like to be able to play a Russian-only playthrough of Stalker one day. That would be so fucking sick.
Have you ever considered having any of your tattoos removed? I'm currently having 2 large pieces taken off, and it's a MF lol.
You know, I'm kind of weird about that. I don't really like tattoo removal. I feel like, if anything, you should be getting blast-overs or cover-ups done instead, unless you're trying to get some kind of a fancy job or something. I'm kind of partial to blackouts. I feel like one day if I get really tired of looking at any tattoos on my body, I'll just get that limb blacked out, because I don't know, I think that looks cool as hell. And even then, after you get something blacked out, you could get scarification, or there's some inks that look really good over black, so you still have options.
Watch any good anime lately? And how are you doing, General?
I'm doing good, thanks for asking. Recently, me and Josine started up what I like to call the catching up arc, so we got current with a bunch of the anime we hadn't watched for a while. So right now we are current with My Hero, One Punch Man, and Dandadan. And we also started watching Fire Force a while back, which is a favorite of mine. Earlier in the year, we finished up Solo Leveling, and that was awesome. Honestly, all the anime that I just listed are recommendations of mine as well. Really, really good stuff.
Come on, give up the goods. What's your most shameful guilty pleasure game?
Honestly, I think there's 3. Really, there's way more than that, but if we have to limit it to just 3, I would say Operation Raccoon City, Final Fantasy VII Dirge of Cerberus, and Resident Evil Dead Aim. I feel like I could fill an entire video of reasons why I get into those 3 bad video games, and maybe a couple other ones. That might be a good video idea for the future.
What's the gnarliest trick you ever landed on a skateboard?
Well, that's a fairly easy one to answer because I'm not very good at skateboarding, but I have kickflipped into 50/50s before, and I would say that's probably the most technical stuff I can do. Although I really enjoy doing tricks with my hands way more. I have a bunch of hand flips and grabs that I do that don't have names because I sort of invented them. I'll probably have something on screen to give you an idea of the weird ass shit that I get up to.
Did you ever play Skies of Arcadia on Dreamcast? And if so, what was your opinion of it compared to other JRPGs?
Skies of Arcadia is an interesting one because I 100% should get into it, but I just can't. I mean, the graphics are bright and colorful, the characters are interesting, the world is kind of amazing, but for some reason, I can't play more than 5 or 6 hours of that game without being bored to tears. Which makes me feel really guilty because there's almost no great RPGs on the Dreamcast, so I'm stuck playing like Evolution, Grandia 2, and Record of Lodoss War over and over again, but I cannot get into Skies of Arcadia. I promise I've tried so many times. Well guys, that is it for today. Thank you so much for making it this far, and thank you to everybody whose name scrolled on screen. I love all of you. Please have a good day, and let's all get really healthy. I'm losing some weight. I'm lifting again. You should be too. All right, peace out, guys.